What's going on, friends? When it comes to your Harley-Davidson, getting the absolute most power out of the bike, this generally starts with your selection of camshaft. But camshafts do provide a lot of horsepower and quite a bit of added torque. But the one thing that'll hold a camshaft back is the actual bore size of the engine. Now, as with anything, when you go bigger on a Harley-Davidson, when you start getting into the big bore kits, a lot of people think at this point, those automatically equal a lot more heat. You're going to feel a lot more heat. These bikes are going to run hotter. Now, while that is true to a degree, that doesn't tell the whole story. Theoretically, adding more displacement to your engine through big bore cylinders, you're making it bigger, you're putting a bigger bore cylinder on it, you're putting a bigger piston in it, you would think that right there is going to generate more heat. Well, it will. It will generate a little bit more heat than what you had, depending on what you're coming from. 88 to a 95, if you're going from a 96 to a 103, 103 to 110, so on and so forth, it will generate a little bit more heat than the previous bore selection that you had. But the biggest thing that is the biggest heat generator when it comes to going to bore sizes is what compression ratio you decide to go with. Now, generally, most of your 103s, these are about 9.7 to 1 stock, pretty mild, and they perform very well with a nice cam in it. But if you're going to go ahead and do a big bore kit and match it with your cam, you're probably going to want to go ahead and get a nice little compression increase. Now, Harley-Davidson engines, they really come alive paired with the right cam and a nice little bump in compression. But that is where the problem lies, is the higher the compression, the more heat output you're going to have. Guys, please don't forget, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now, there's a lot of reasons for wanting to go with a big bore kit on your bike. Number one is torque. There's no replacement for displacement, and one of the biggest ways to increase the torque on your motorcycle is going to be through a big bore kit. Cams will do a lot for horsepower. They'll do a lot for torque too. But where the right cam can really be held back is not having a big displacement increase. Now, you can go ahead and do a large displacement increase. You're going to gain horsepower. You're going to gain a lot of torque. And not to mention, you might not really have as much heat output as you might think. Now, the biggest thing when it comes to a big bore setup, especially a bolt-on kit, is the cylinder spigot's actually smaller. The cylinder walls are actually probably a little thinner. Now, that may be true if you actually have it bored out and put back on the bike. But bolt-on kits, the cylinder spigots are actually made a little thinner and out of a higher tensile strength material at the bottom. That is so that the cylinder spigots don't crack under pressure, even though they're thinner. Now, at the same time, one of the biggest thoughts out there is that by having the thinner cylinder walls, you're feeling more heat. You're radiating more heat out of the bike. Yes and no, that's true. But as I mentioned, pretty much all the heat output is going to come from the compression. Because when it comes to compression, the higher compression, you're getting more power using less fuel. And when you're doing that, you're still running basically a little bit leaner, and the higher the compression ratio, the higher the heat output from the engine is going to be. That's why when you look at a compression ratio on a lot of the water-cooled bikes, they're pretty high. They're 11 to 1, 12.5 to 1. I mean, they are way up there. I mean, just look at the Pan America and the Sportster S, these new liquid-cooled Harley motors. The compression ratio is way up there, higher than you could ever run it with an air-cooled engine. That is why when you get into like the Milwaukee 8, they're running a 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, but they also have a 4-valve head, and they come stock with oil coolers. As with anything, definitely an oil cooler is always recommended, especially if you're going with a big bore kit and you're increasing compression. Now, what compression ratio do you need to be running? Well, that depends on what you want your setup to be. You can absolutely go with a big bore kit and a nice cam and still keep basically a 9.7 to 1, 9.8 roughly in their compression ratio. But if you're going to do that, go ahead and go 10 to 1. 10 to 1 is very streetable. It's not going to put out a whole lot of heat. And honestly, I'd highly recommend an oil cooler. But I'd say at 10 to 1 compression, you could probably get away without running an oil cooler. Now, on an air-cooled engine, especially if you're running a twin cam or even an Evo, 10.5 to 1 is really high for an Evo. But for a twin cam engine, 10.5 to 1, that's when we start getting into high compression. 10.5 to 1 is that's about as high as I want to go on a street engine. Anything above that, you're probably going to likely run into knocking and pinging issues. And here's the other caveat to that. At 10.5 to 1, you got to keep that motor cool. When those bikes start getting hot, At 10.5 to 1 compression, they're definitely more susceptible to knocking and pinging. Even at 10 to 1, you may run into this issue. So that's where the oil cooler comes in. That's why I highly recommend running an oil cooler even at 10 to 1 compression. But definitely at 10.5 to 1, be considering that oil cooler because you want to keep the engine cool. As I mentioned, you're generating more heat with that higher compression. And with more heat, you're out on a hot summer day, you're running down the highway, you're under load, that bike's going to start to knock and ping, and detonation is not good on any engine, especially your Harley. So guys, even if you do put a big bore kit on your bike, it really doesn't matter what size you go up to, you're going to get quite a bit of a horsepower increase, and as I mentioned, that's where a majority of your torque comes from. There is no replacement for that displacement when it comes to torque output. Now, with all that being said, if you're going to build your engine, I definitely recommend going up to 10 to 1 with your camshaft, maybe even 10.5 to 1, but at 10.5 to 1, that's where we really want to start thinking about really keeping the bike cooled down. But at the same time, there are so many benefits to going with the bigger bore. It doesn't matter if you got an 88, you're going to a 95, you want to bolt on a 100-inch kit. Even 103s going to 110s or even 113s. There's so many different options out there. And honestly, guys, a lot of the horsepower and torque numbers, they're pretty much the same when we start getting into the bigger displacements when it comes to the twin cams. Those bikes are all pretty even Steven in there when it comes to horsepower output and torque output. It really comes down to we're splitting hairs on a dyno chart at what throttle, what RPM, how much horsepower and torque you're making. Honestly, in my opinion, you probably wouldn't even really feel the difference. Air-cooled engines, especially Harley-Davidson engines, they can only handle so much compression for the street. Honestly, you're getting in anything over 10.5 to 1, take that to the track. That's not going to be a very fun streetable motor. They're going to run pretty hot, especially if you don't have an oil cooler. Even with an oil cooler, dual oil coolers on it, 10.5 to 1, you're going to be fine. But anything over 10.5 to 1 compression, that's where things really start to heat up, especially when it comes to a big bore kit. So when it comes to big bores, it really doesn't matter how big of a displacement that you go with. Whether you're going through the cylinder or you're actually going through the crank or a combination of both. Most of that heat generated from that engine at that point, that's going to come down to what compression ratio you're running. The lower the compression ratio, you're going to get less performance, but the bike's going to run cooler. Now, the higher the compression ratio, you're going to definitely get more performance, more power, but you're going to generate more heat. And the other way to get around that is proper tuning. Get the bike fueled properly, add an oil cooler on it, and you guys can experiment with this a little bit if you like. You can add an oil cooler, see what it drops the temperature to. You can change your fueling in the bike. Just kind of experiment with it and kind of get it where that bike's happy and it's staying cool. But guys, honestly, as I mentioned, you start going up the bigger bores, higher compressions, that's where you're going to get in trouble. Make sure to keep it down about 10.5 to 1 on the street. Keep it below that. That's where I'd like to stay. And honestly, 10.5 to 1, that's where a Harley-Davidson engine really comes to life, especially with a good cam in that. Because Harley engines, they love compression, especially with the right camshafts. And then also with compression, you really want to be thinking about compression releases. If you don't have a 103 with the automatics in them, there are some options out there for manual compression releases that actually screw in with the spark plugs. That is probably one of the quickest, easiest options out there, unless you want to take your heads to a machine shop and actually have a machine for some manual compression releases, or go ahead and have a machine for some automatics. That is definitely something that you're going to need. When you get up to 10 to 1, 10.5 to 1, they really don't like to turn over. If you've got a high torque starter on it, great, but eventually it's going to wear things out, especially when you're pushing that much compression. You're getting that much squeeze on that air and fuel in that engine. It's going to make the power, but it'll also be extremely hard to start. So guys, I want your opinions on compression ratios. What do you guys like to run? Do you like to stay stock? Do you like to fall in the middle about 10 to 1? Or do you like to go 10.5 to 1? Let me know your experience and what you like and what kind of heat output you've gotten off your build after you've upped the compression. But guys, that's all I've got for you this week. If you guys enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But till next week, guys, you stay safe on the streets, ride smart, dodge those cars, and I'll catch you guys back here next week with a brand new video. Thanks for watching.